Let's start where you began, Vinod, and your education and what led you to biophysics in particular.
So that's actually quite a journey, Mahesh. Thank you again for having me here and for the opportunity to actually be a part of the Professor Mahesh podcast. I've actually listened to this with great interest, not only this past few weeks that I've been here in Chennai, but also earlier I'd come across a couple of these things and think that the idea of reaching out to our young people is so important because they are the future. It's not us.
Thank you.
So my journey, I sometimes characterize it as a drunken man's wandering. It's a random walk almost. So I grew up in Delhi and actually started at the IIT Delhi on a BTech in civil engineering, but I'd already gotten admission and a scholarship to Cornell University. But that was 1985, and you know how it was. Visas were not exactly easy to come by, but it did happen. And so I left very quickly, and I went off to Cornell to study what was then, as it seems to be now, the field of interest that attracts all people, which is computer science. And it took me all of, I think, 3 months to realize when I got there that this was not what I wanted to do. And that comes back to, I think, the topic of our conversation today. So I ended up actually at that time realizing after my first programming course that this really didn't float my boat. And I sort of got into this mode of thinking of saying, what do you do now? So I ended up in electrical engineering. And the reason I did electrical engineering was not because it was the default option, but because at Cornell, that was a time of lasers and where, the main sort of advances that were being made in new laser technology, femtosecond laser technology and color center lasers was actually in the electrical engineering department. And there was a professor there called Pollock, who actually was a very inspiring man. And I felt I really wanted to work together with him. And this is the other thing that happens when you come into a university setting, is that you get inspired by people. You get inspired by teachers. And you say, wow, I want to be like him or her. And this is what happened. And I got sucked into this optical sciences business. And so it was almost by default that I ended up being in electrical engineering. I got a degree in electrical engineering. I take pride in telling people that I almost also got a degree in archaeology. Because,
wow.
Speaking of interdisciplinarity, I mean, I had the opportunity at Cornell. We had to, as first-year students, to take courses outside our field and outside the School of Engineering. So I had to take so-called freshman seminar, and I came into I came into contact with art history and archaeology, and I got a chance to do some of that work. And after my first year, I actually got to go on a field trip in Europe. I was 18 years old, and I was going off and doing archaeological digging. So this was great. But anyway, I didn't do that. I ended up ultimately getting a degree in electrical engineering and then going on to graduate school at the University of Michigan. And at the University of Michigan, I was going to do the traditional electrical engineering, but they were starting a new program called applied physics. And when I went to visit the University of Michigan, I met a very inspiring professor, Duncan Steele, who ended up being my graduate advisor, who says, look, you shouldn't be going to, he was joint appointed in electrical engineering, so I got to see him, but he said, no, you need to go into applied physics, although you're not a physicist, because I think this marriage of things that you're looking at doing, lasers and semiconductors and so on, this is where you should be. It was again an accident, a circumstance, and that's what happened. And a few years into that journey, I realized that I wasn't actually very happy doing, shooting lasers at semiconductors. And Duncan was, but he was a fantastic human being, and I wanted to continue to work with him. And this notion of interdisciplinarity was actually very much manifested in him. He was one of the first. He was, I think, what I call one of the pioneers of interdisciplinarity. He had another lab. He had a lab in the so-called Institute of Gerontology. You would never think an electrical engineer would end up in an Institute of Gerontology, where he was working together with a biochemist, a chap called Ari Gaffney, who was another fantastic individual. And what they were trying to do was actually understand how proteins are folding and misfolding using laser technology.
Mm.
So I had the chance actually to just sort of transfer my work with Duncan from electrical engineering to this Institute of Gerontology, where I ended up actually working on a biophysical problem. And in 2 years, I'd gotten my degree.
Mm.
Yeah? And so for a lot of our young people who seem to think that there is a well thought out path, that's not how it works usually in life. Yeah? And maybe you should, what I learned from that whole process was, of course, was to be open to these unusual sort of turns in the road and to sort of seize those opportunities.